is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Eugenie Scott is a physical anthropologist, and she's the executive director of the National Center for Science Education, which is a nonprofit, a not-for-profit membership organization for scientists, for teachers, and for other people who are interested in science. And the organization works to improve the teaching of evolution and of science as a way of knowing. As a former college professor, she's an internationally known expert on the creationism and evolution controversy, and is called upon by press, other media, and courts to explain science and evolution to the general public. She's the author of Evolution versus Creationism, an Introduction, and is a co-editor with Glenn Branch of Not in Our Classrooms, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong for Our Schools. She's a recipient of numerous awards from scientists and educators and has been awarded 6 honorary degrees. So she's going to give a talk today on Demonizing Darwin, and Dr. Chris Soper, a political science professor from Pepperdine University, is going to be delivering the response. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Eugenie Scott.
Well, I am absolutely delighted to have been invited to participate in this wonderful commemoration of Darwin's 200th birthday and the 150th anniversary of On the Origin of Species. And I really, really like the T-shirts that you all ran for this, Darwin 09. That was cool. That's really very good. You know, if you've been here for the last couple of days, you've noticed a lot of discussion about Darwinism this, Darwinism that. Do we have any Darwinists here? Do we have any Darwinists here? Oh, that's interesting. We don't seem to have any. Good. There's one. Do we have any Lyellists here? No geologists? Do we have any Kelvinists here? Any Kelvinists? How odd. How very peculiar. Well, the point being here, I have yet to go to a professional meeting, and I go to a lot of science professional meetings, a lot of association meetings, and observe my colleagues going up and saying, "Hi, I understand you're a botanist. I'm a Darwinist." I mean, generally speaking, the term that we use in science to refer to ourselves is evolutionary biologists. The term Darwinist tends to be used by historians, by philosophers, by people outside of science, and it tends to have in that context a fairly specific meaning of referring to the ideas of Charles Darwin in the 19th century. Now, unfortunately, in the world of anti-evolution, which is where I live, not as one, mind you, but as someone who studies them and monitors them and tries to do something about them, among the anti-evolutionists, Darwinist has become an epithet. Darwinist is a bad thing. And it's simultaneously a synonym for modern evolutionary biology, which really doesn't make sense, because as you've heard, even from Dr. Honeycutt a moment ago and from previous speakers, modern evolutionary biology has gone way beyond what Charles Darwin knew in the 19th century, as you would expect, just as modern geology has gone very far beyond what Lyell knew of geology in the 19th century, and modern physics has gone way beyond what Kelvin knew about physics in the 19th century. So we don't expect Darwinism to really express in science what we're talking about when we talked about evolutionary biology. But to the anti-evolutionist, a Darwinist is a practitioner of an evil ideology of Darwinism. And obviously we want to keep isms out of science. So Darwinism becomes an epithet. So I tend not to talk about Darwinism, and I certainly discourage any of my colleagues and any of you students from using the phrase, the term Darwinism as a synonym for evolutionary biology. It isn't. You're not a Lyellist, you're not a Darwinist, you're an evolutionary biologist. But I'm going to talk today about just a little bit first about what modern evolutionary biologists mean by evolution, because nobody's ever actually done that so far. And I find in dealing with this topic with the general public that that's kind of a useful place to start, because the word evolution has a variety of meanings in people's brains, and it's only fair that you know what the meaning is in my brain as we start off our next 20 minutes or so together. I'm going to suggest to you that evolution, modern evolutionary biology, is a 3-part idea. There's the big idea, and there's also the pattern of evolution and the process of evolution. The big idea of evolutionary biology is common ancestry. In Darwin's terms, living things descended with modification from common ancestors. And this is, of course, a very important concept to biology as a whole. It's the idea of common ancestry. There are ancestral and descendant species. Think of evolution as a genealogical relationship of species through time, an ancestral-descendant relationship. Now, we study this ancestral relationship of species by studying the processes or the mechanisms, the things that bring about evolution. Obviously, Darwin's idea of natural selection is the most important of these, but as has been discussed, there are a number of other factors that affect how evolution takes place. We also talk about the pattern of evolution. We also talk about how this genealogical relationship of species, Darwin's tree of life, how this tree branched through time. And I'd like to present the idea that these three components of modern evolutionary biology really are independent of one another. And historically, this is true as well. Remember that when Darwin proposed evolution by natural selection, the idea of evolution, as was explained in talks yesterday, the idea of common ancestry was accepted pretty quickly. Natural selection, not so much. Natural selection was a bit of a harder sell to both scientists and to the general public, and there were reasons for that. Natural selection was a more incomplete theory in Darwin's day. It is a much more complete explanation today. Similarly, the kinds of data and inferences that we use to talk about natural selection or talk about non-selective means of change or other processes of evolution. Those data and theory are very different from the data and theory that we use to infer that living things had common ancestors. Similarly, those two sets of data and inferences are rather different from the data and inferences that we use in describing the tree of life. And quite commonly, somebody who is a pattern kind of evolutionist is different from his colleague down the hall who is a process kind of evolutionist. We both talk to each other and we understand each other's arguments, but one tends to do research in one area or another. Not that there aren't people who are, bilingual, as it were. But by and large, these three components are related, but they are independent in many respects, although obviously overlapping. Now, you heard a lot, we had some interesting discussions yesterday about how, whether, one question period talked about whether there's a lot of variation within religion, but less variation within science regarding evolution, but the point was made that, well, obviously there are many points of disagreement within evolutionary biology. I think we can clarify that a little bit if we look at these three components. The big idea of evolution, the idea that living things, the inference, it is an inference, it's not an observation, it's an inference, which all important theoretical explanations are inferences, logical inferences. The inference that living things had common ancestors is something that is extraordinarily well accepted in science, not just in biology, but in science across the board. We're just not arguing about the whether. We're just not arguing about whether living things had common ancestors. We are having vigorous discussion within science about the processes and the pattern of evolution. And here is where our discussion yesterday, I think, makes a little bit more sense. All sciences argue about the details, and evolutionary biologists certainly argue about the details of process and the details of pattern. But really, we're not arguing about the whether. But this, of course, is the position of the anti-evolutionists, and they often present disputes among scientists about whether natural selection, for example, can explain the body plans of the Cambrian, or whether the body plans of the Cambrian explosion, which is a pattern argument, is a fatal flaw for Darwinian gradualism. Creationists bring up these kinds of arguments as if they were arguments against the whether, as if they were arguments against the big idea of evolution. This is a category error. It is a logical error which should be dismissed very, very quickly. But please do be reassured that we're not arguing about the whether. We're having a very fine scientific debate about the details. And that is, I think, a more useful way of looking at things. So getting to Darwin. On the Origin of Species, he basically had one long argument, as you heard yesterday, about two basic points. One, that descent with modification had happened, living things have common ancestors, and his argument that natural selection was the main mechanism, the main force bringing this about. Both of these points are relevant to the idea of demonizing Darwin that I'm going to be talking about this morning. Indeed, some come to bury Darwin, not to praise him, and not in a good way. There are two ways that Darwin has been demonized. Darwin, the person, has been demonized, and the ideas of Darwin, the idea of common ancestry and the idea of natural selection. But the demonization of Darwin takes place among different communities and therefore takes different shapes. So to begin with a couple of generalizations, there's more than one kind of anti-evolutionism, for starters, though for our purposes their similarities are more important than their differences. And also, the demonization of evolution takes place primarily among Christians, although, as we heard yesterday from Ron Numbers, anti-evolutionism is spreading throughout the planet, and there's a pretty vigorous anti-evolutionism that is growing in Muslim communities as well, and Islam. But I'm going to primarily be talking about Christians today. The individuals, the groups that are demonizing Darwin, that are critical of evolution and evolution by natural selection, belong roughly to two different kinds of groups. There are the Bible-based anti-evolutionists, people who follow Henry Morris and creation science, sometimes referred to as young earth creationisms. We heard about them in yesterday's arguments. There also are another group, much smaller group, which we can refer to roughly as the design-based anti-evolutionists or intelligent design supporters. Now, different scholars of this issue have slightly different nuances of opinion. By and large, my friend Ron Numbers and I agree on lots and lots about the relationship between creation science and intelligent design, but we do have some nuances of differences. I see intelligent design as being a subset of creation science. Creation science is the larger circle there. By this I mean that there are many claims within creation science which are not made by intelligent design. For example, in creation science, you'll find concern about the age of the earth. You'll have a great deal of concern about flood geology, which Ron described so nicely yesterday. You have a lot of concern about tracking a literal interpretation of the Bible pretty closely in explaining the history of the earth and the history of life on it. Intelligent design doesn't discuss that kind of stuff. Intelligent design is a subset which ignores many of the claims of young earth creationism, but does retain the core of young earth creationism in many respects, which is the design argument, the idea that there's really, really, really complicated stuff out there in nature, whether this is cosmology or on the small scale and things like vertebrate eyes or bacteria flagella motors. There's really, really, really complicated stuff out there that can't possibly be the result of natural causes, because only intelligent causes can produce things of very high complexity or high improbability. And of course, the intelligent agent naturally spells his name with 3 letters. First is G. I'll give you a hint if you are confused about that particular source. Ron and I both agree that the book Of Pandas and People is an extremely important document in the history of intelligent design, and we both recognize that this has very, very deep roots in creation science. We differ on some of our other interpretations, but by and large, we certainly see a lot of similarity between the two movements. Clearly, our difference focuses more on the importance of the young earth aspect of creation science. But in my view, in my experience with intelligent design, I have not found anything in intelligent design literature, any of their claims, which did not pre-exist in creation science, which is why I place it in this particular nested relationship. Both intelligent design and creation science proponents follow a Christian doctrine called special creationism. Now, obviously, God creates. All Christians believe God creates. But special creationism is a particular theological view about how God creates. And in special creationism, God creates everything in its present form. So when you look out at all the galaxies of the universe, God created them all at one time. Or at least, let me correct that. When you look at all the galaxies of the universe, God created them in their present form. There might be an occasional supernova here and there, but basically, what you see is what there was at the time of creation. When you see living things on planet Earth, plants and animals, God created these according to specially created kinds. And kinds of organisms have limited genetic variability. You cannot go from one kind to another. The kinds are separately created, as it says in a literal interpretation of the Bible. Now, the most common form of special creationism you're going to run into is the young earth form of special creationism, the strict biblical literalism, where God creates all of the universe in terms of 6 24-hour days. But there are variants of special creationism. There are other interpretations of Genesis which are, in my opinion, specially creationist, but they are more flexible on things like age of the earth and the specifics. There's one form, for example, which is called progressive creationism, which accepts an ancient age of the earth, accepts radioisotopic dating, accepts physics and chemistry, but still has a problem with biological sciences, in which God creates consecutively through time. So God first creates single-celled organisms, and then simple metazoa, and then more complex metazoa, and then the Cambrian explosion, and then gets into vertebrates, and then amphibians, and then he creates reptiles and mammals and lions and tigers and bears and so forth. And God separately creates at intervals throughout time. That's something called progressive creationism. Now, the intelligent design folks generally talk about things like the bacteria flagellum motor, this motor that makes the flagellum rotate, which is a pretty highly complex molecular structure. It's a pretty neat system. It's about 40 or 50 proteins, depending, of course, on what kind of flagellum you're talking about. By the way, there's lots of different flagella. The ID folks talk about the flagellum, and that's just wrong. I mean, there's lots of different flagella, and there's homologs between them, and you can actually produce this through evolution. But never mind. And by the way, there's probably a molecular biologist sitting or cellular biologist sitting in the audience saying, that's wrong. That's not how it works. The flagellum goes like this, right? It doesn't undulate. True. But I got this from a creationist website, so, it's just such a cool graphic. I use it anyway, right? So that's not how it works, but, it got your attention to the front of the room, didn't it? That's what it's for. We teachers have our manipulative ways here. The ID people, in my opinion, are also special creationists because the argument of irreducible complexity is that natural selection and really no natural cause can produce something really complex like the motor of the bacteria flagellum. So the bacteria flagellum, although they don't say so in so many words, is specially created. That is special creationism, even if you're not producing a whole organism, even if you're not producing a whole eye, even if you're just producing a little motor. That's still special creationism. But it's a more mild form. And again, you have to recognize there's lots of variations, not only within Christianity, but also within anti-evolutionism. With reference to plants and animals, these kinds have independent origins in God. In the young earth creationist literature, you find references to the creationist orchard, in which God creates the kinds of organisms, hence the single stem at the bottom, but then there can be variation within the kind. There can be evolution within the kind. And so therefore, and as Ron Numbers was talking about yesterday, this is very important to maintain the ark story as a literal historical event. Because God can create X number of kinds which can all fit on the ark, but then actually it's male and female of each kind, not a pair. There's actually 7 pair of each clean kind and 5 pair of each unclean kind. They get off the ark and then they radiate into the modern variety of species that we have. So maybe there was only See, dogs are clean. There's only 7 pairs of dogs, so therefore that dog kind would radiate into wolves and foxes and coyotes and jackals, and they even think hyenas, except hyenas are cats, but never mind. So the idea of variation or evolution within the kind is accepted. The intelligent design creationists have similar views. In this recent book, Explore Evolution, produced by personnel from the Discovery Institute, they have the creationist orchard in its young earth creationist glory. It's exactly the same kind of idea. And you find testimonial statements supporting the idea of special creation among both the young earthers and the intelligent design supporters. William Dembski says, yes, I do believe that organisms have undergone some change in the course of natural history, though I believe that this change has occurred within strict limits, that's the orchard, and that human beings were specially created. Now, conservative Christians view evolution and faith to be a dichotomous choice. You can have either the Bible or you can have evolution. One is much more reliable than the other. One is permanent, one is constantly changing. Well, about the constantly changing part, guilty as charged. The strength of science is that we are able to change our explanations with new data and new information and new theoretical perspectives. This is not a weakness. This is a strength of science, and it's one of the major reasons, that and the fact that we test our explanations, one of the major reasons why we have managed to learn so much about the natural world in the last 300 years. Sometimes evolution is accused as being dogmatic. Evolution is a dogma. We are unable to change our minds. We are just in this rut of accepting evolution. Well, no. It's not a belief. Any of you who say you believe in evolution, you don't. Evolution isn't a belief. We accept evolution because it happens to be, common ancestry happens to be the best explanation we have for why we have the variety of living organisms looking the way they do today. But it's not a belief. If somebody comes up with a better explanation for all of the things evolution explains, that'll be really interesting. Will we have a bunch of new science to do? Wow. Sometimes when I talk at campuses, I say, scientists, raise your hand if you think we've answered all the questions there are to answer about the natural world. And everybody laughs and nobody puts their hands up. We've got a lot more to learn about the natural world. We have a lot more to learn about evolution. We know a lot about evolution already. And what we know is only getting better and better reinforced by the new discoveries. But we're perfectly willing to change and alter our decisions. So it's unfortunate, I think, for people of faith that the anti-evolutionists are trying to present this as if this is a dichotomous choice. It's also not really true that the Bible is unchanging. In fact, I was delighted that David gave a little example of how the Bible has been translated from one language to another, and words are shifted around and meaning is shifted around. I once saw a videotape of some Appalachians, religious people, Pentecostalists, and this fellow was saying, well, of course some people are better than others. It just so happens, and he used the term, Negras are inferior to whites because it says so in the Bible. And the interviewer was kind of curious about that. And he went on, the old guy went on to say, well, sure, in the Bible it says that Jesus gave 40 talents to one person and 20 talents to another, so some people are more talented. Okay? Now, anybody who interprets that passage of the Bible in that fashion doesn't understand the Bible. Okay? The Bible has been interpreted in various ways over time. Christian religion, as we know from looking at the history, has evolved, if nothing else on the planet has. So it is not strictly true that religion is unchanging forever and ever and ever, and science is this wishy-washy mess that you can't trust. But for conservative Christians, the Bible is often presented as an undivisible whole. This chap says, the 6 creation days issue in Genesis isn't important to Scripture. I'll just take the 6 days right out of my Bible. And he's got this problem, and of course, pretty soon he ends up with a mess. So, I was once on a panel with a fundamentalist preacher, and there were three of us on the panel. There was him, there was me, and then there was an Episcopalian minister. I'm sorry, a Baptist minister, but this was before Southern Baptists got weird. So a Southern Baptist minister, and he was on my side of this issue. You know, he did not want creationism to be taught in the public schools. And we had a cordial panel, and nothing got done. And afterwards, I was talking to the fundamentalist minister. I said, well, you know, why does the Bible have to be interpreted literally? You know, why can't you interpret the Bible like Reverend so-and-so, the Baptist I was with? And he said, if Genesis isn't true, how do I know Revelations isn't true? His idea was the whole Bible has to be taken as a piece. You can't pick and choose. Now, the stakes are therefore very high for young earth creationists. Salvation, number one, depends on a literal interpretation of Genesis for many of these people. In this diagram, and actually I think there might accidentally be a pointer here, which I have, of course, set aside and have no idea. Anyway, take a look here. This is the good guy version. In the young earth version, there's no death before Adam, and then after Adam's sin brings death into the world, and then you have a period of death. But then eventually the redemption, the revelation, the second coming is going to happen, and then there will be no death, and everything will be very nice. This is contrasted with the evolutionary point of view, which is man's opinion, where life and death have always existed. There's been nothing but millions and millions of years of death, and there'll never be any salvation, there'll never be any resurrection, and everything will be gloom and doom. So this is this kind of stark dichotomous choice that people from certain religious traditions predict. So the first big consequence is the loss of salvation, and this is a big deal. No question about that. The second is morality and lack of standards and loss of a civil society, so to speak. They believe that without creation, there's no standard for morality or meaning of life. Creation implies God. And if there's no creation, there's no God. If there's no God, there's no morality, and you see what happens when evolution rules. In the creationist literature, there's a very well-developed iconography of trees of evil. And just the whole idea that if you give up your faith in God, you will have no reason to behave morally and ethically, and therefore society will simply go to hell in a handbag. The great Henry Morris once wrote that evolution is the foundation of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Keynesianism, materialism, atheism, and in the religious world, modernism and neo-orthodoxy. Jesus said, "A good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit." In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today. In this tree from the Bible Science newsletter 1980, you see that the source of all of these evils, evils like atheism, oppression, social gospel, secular humanism, perversion of churches, acceptance of homosexuality. Oddly enough, you've got astronomy, medicine, biology, and geology. This always struck me as a somewhat ambiguous evil tree, but nonetheless, humanism is the source of all of these evil, and of course, evolution is the source of humanism. So the idea that humanism being the no-God view, evolution supports the idea there's no God, supports the idea, it allows all these evils to take place. And of course, the most Baroque example of this, and my absolute favorite, is one that one of my board members collected at a 1992 program, a conference of the Bible Science Association, in which you have a quite horrid, withered tree of evil with lots of bad things like abortion and pornography and the usual isms of communism and sexism and Marxism and radical feminist movement and so forth and so on, racism and the like. Full disclosure here, as a humanist, I really haven't murdered anyone in weeks. But of course, evolution is the source of all of these evils, because evolution means you can't believe in God, and therefore this whole edifice falls. Just to let you know that trees of evil, sort of over-the-top trees of evil of this sort, are not restricted only to Christians. This is the 1898 Freethinkers pictorial illustration of the Christian tree of evil. And it's really quite wonderful. And the axe of truth is cutting down anyway, the trees of evil seem to be a very popular iconography, regardless of your particular perspective. Certainly, if there's a conflict between Bible and science, it is clear which one wins. Something of an anti-intellectual component to this, but I think there's one more. I think we get a reference. Yes, we get a reference to that. So there you have it. Although the iconography of the young earth creationists is more extreme, and the position is more directly tied to the Bible, very similar views are held by intelligent design proponents such as Philip Johnson. He writes, I wanted to know whether the fundamentals of the Christian worldview were fact or fantasy. Darwinism is a logical place to begin because if Darwinism is true, Christian metaphysics is fantasy. Again, this dichotomous point of view. You've got to choose between evolution or Christianity. The dichotomous choice, although most of the intelligent design supporters are not as explicit about tying their rejection of evolution so directly to the incompatibility of evolution with a literal interpretation of the Bible. But certainly, the demonization of Darwin began long ago. William Jennings Bryan is famous for prosecuting John Scopes in 1925, and the caricature of Bryan is that he was this Bible-beating fundamentalist, which is really too bad, because Bryan was a really neat guy in a lot of ways. I think Bryan could get elected in Berkeley any week. I mean, he wasn't as religiously conservative as portrayed, as Ron Numberd pointed out yesterday. He did oppose evolution for religious reasons, certainly, but he was as much or more concerned about what he believed were the implications of evolution, particularly evolution by natural selection, for the society as a whole. What we would call social Darwinism today. He was much more concerned with what he thought were those evil effects. In some respect, it's sort of the top part of those trees of evil. And indeed, there were many ideologues in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who seized upon evolution to promote their views, most notably the laissez-faire capitalists and the eugenicists. Andrew Carnegie and other laissez-faire capitalists justified sweatshops and child labor, exploitation of the worker, as being part of the natural and natural selective order. As Carnegie said, quote, while the law of competition may sometimes be hard for the individual, it is best for the race, because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. So it was okay if workers had to work 10-hour days for 6 days a week. You give them off Sunday so they can go to church. And thank God for their wonderful opportunity of working for Andrew Carnegie. The idea of capitalism as Darwinism has continued into modern iconography as well. There's lots of examples. The man is saying, understand, Richardson, I don't believe in evolution, but I do believe in Darwinism. Yeah, so this is another example of what I was talking about in the beginning. Darwinism tends to have something to do with natural selection, but in science we tend not to use it to refer to evolutionary biology because it's such an ambiguous term. But here it's used in the context of natural selection, and the capitalist behind the desk there is being very clear about separating evolution from natural selection. So, eugenics is perhaps the most serious charge brought against the ideas of Charles Darwin. Francis Galton read his cousin Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species and was inspired to develop ideas about the betterment of the human species, which largely involved encouraging the most fit to marry and have children. He was applying his cousin's ideas of natural selection to the human species, but frankly, compared to some of the eugenicists that came after Galton, he was considerably mild in his views. Galton, by the way, was a very interesting character, if you ever read about him. He really had a very scientific mind. I think it kind of ran in that Darwin and Wedgwood family. He once wrote a paper on how to cut a cake so that you had the least amount of surface area and therefore the least likelihood of the cake going stale. I mean, he was this mathematician. So, he did some kind of interesting things. He's sort of demonized as being this wicked, horrid eugenicist, but he had a number of redeeming qualities, I think, in many ways. Now, unquestionably, eugenics is a black mark on European and American history. Terrible things were done in the name of eugenics. There's no question about that. In the United States, there were sterilization laws passed in many states in which people who were judged to be mentally feeble were sterilized because that way they wouldn't pass on their bad heredity. Many of these people's greatest crime was being poor. Being poor was considered an indication that you were mentally feeble. Again, this whole sort of, laissez-faire capitalist idea of the cream will rise to the top. Cream rises to the top as long as you don't have inherited wealth. I notice an awful lot of libertarians and capitalists aren't arguing for 100% confiscation of wealth every generation, which of course would indeed let the cream rise to the top. But somehow or another, they feel that the wealth should be passed on each generation, which kind of undercuts your argument for a natural selection of merit. But there were really awful, awful things done in the name of eugenics. It is a black mark in history. And some extremely prominent and intelligent people bought into these ideas that we could improve the human species either by positive eugenics of encouraging smart people and wealthy people to marry, or negative eugenics, which was far more lethal, in some cases literally, discouraging or preventing the unfit, as that was defined, from reproducing. People like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, David Starr Jordan, very famous scientist in the late 19th century of the United States. In England, people like Winston Churchill, H.G. Wells, Maynard Keynes, George Bernard Shaw. Lots of people bought into the eugenics idea, even the churches. If you go to this website, you will find a statement from the United Methodist Church that apologizes for its early 20th century support of eugenics. It writes, "Ironically, as the eugenics movement came to the United States, the churches, especially the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians, embraced it. Methodist churches around the country promoted the American Eugenics Society Fitter Family Contests, wherein the fittest families were invariably fair-skinned and well-off. Methodist bishops endorsed one of the first books circulated in the U.S. churches promoting eugenics. Unlike the battles over evolution and creationism, both conservative and progressive church leaders endorsed eugenics." And to its credit, the United Methodist Church has apologized for its role. A lot of the bad guys of history are claimed to be inspired by Darwin. In most cases, that's distinctly an overstatement. One of the legends about Darwin is that Karl Marx asked Darwin if Marx could dedicate the second edition of Das Kapital to Darwin, and Darwin declined. Actually, this is a confusion between two letters that were found in the Darwin archives. Another letter was sent to Darwin asking if he would endorse a particular book, and Darwin said, "No, thank you very much, I don't do this sort of thing." Marx did send a copy of Das Kapital to Darwin, and Darwin wrote him a letter saying, "Thank you very much for sending me this book." Darwin was a gentleman. This is what you do. You write a letter and thank people when they give you gifts, right? You all do that, right? At Christmas time, you write thank you letters, right? Okay. And but apparently Darwin never read the book, because when it was found on his shelves, most of the pages still had not been slit. In the old days, the pages were slit until you read them. Now, indeed, Marx did like evolution because he felt it supported the idea that the working class could eventually better itself. Darwin wrote, "Darwin's work is most important and suits my purpose in that it provides a basis in natural science for the historical class struggle." But Marx wasn't all that nuts about natural selection, because natural selection has ties to Malthus and ties to the erection of poor laws and all these other kinds of negative social Darwinist things. And Marx certainly was not keen on that sort of thing. the common claim you run into is that Hitler was inspired by evolution as well. The master race of Aryans was destined to triumph over the lesser races. Now, the evidence is not very good for that. Certainly, if you read Mein Kampf, alas, there are far more references to Jesus than to Darwin, far more references to Christianity than to evolution. Not very many people would be very happy saying, therefore, Christianity inspired Nazism. I think we can just give Hitler his own credit for that. I don't think we have to blame either Christianity or evolution. And actually, evolution doesn't provide support for this Aryan superiority idea. Because remember, what evolution predicts, what natural selection predicts, is that a population will be selected to be successful in that particular environment. There is no such thing as the superior phenotype that is going to be the master race in all environments that you encounter. So actually, evolution by natural selection is an argument against Aryan superiority. It's understandable why Hitler might not have used it. But actually, Hitler just was ignorant of science in general, and I don't think he actually knew very much about natural selection one way or the other. Answers in Genesis claims that Joseph Stalin was a seminary student until he read Darwin and lost his faith. And then he became a revolutionary, and of course his life was marked by brutal dictatorship, and he is really one of history's bad guys. Actually, Stalin didn't know or care much about science at all, much like Hitler. He was a Marxist, and to the extent that Marxism deals with the sort of materialist explanation of society, and Darwin dealt with the materialist explanation of organisms, yeah, fine, we're kind of talking on the same page here. And some forms of evolution, though not Darwin's version, are progressive. Well, then, therefore, Marxism is progressive. We can improve the working class. So, there were these kind of loose ways that you could grab this ideology and use it. But Stalin promoted Lysenkoism. Stalin promoted Lamarckism, which is a very un-Darwinian kind of point of view. So we should be whacking Lysenko if we're going to be blaming Stalin for getting his inspiration from science. But it just simply is a wrong idea in general. I want you to consider there's something funny going on here. Supposedly, Andrew Carnegie and Karl Marx both embraced evolution by natural selection. Now, how can the same idea support both laissez-faire capitalism and Marxism? There's something wrong here. Perhaps there's a deeper issue that you ought to be considering. And this is an important point here. Ideologues are perfectly capable of taking advantage of any powerful idea to push their ideologies. Science is a powerful cultural institution. Science is going to be incorporated by ideologues to push their ideas. Science was incorporated by the eugenicists to promote ideas of racial superiority and inferiority. Modern-day evolutionary biology is actually the best bulwark you have against racism. If you really understand the genetically based theory of evolution that we use today, this is your best argument against racism. But in the past, it was used to argue for racism, for a hierarchical ranking of populations of races in America. Religion is similarly a powerful set of ideas. Religions have been incorporated into ideologies. We see plenty of examples of that. That doesn't mean that religion is bad. Because ideologues seize religious ideas to promote their views, it doesn't mean science is bad, because ideologues seize science to promote their views. Evolution has been greatly misused, particularly by the eugenicists, less so by some of the other claims are not as accurate. But this does not mean, A, that evolution is not valid. It is an accurate way of describing the natural world. It works really well. We feel very confident that living things descended with modification from common ancestors. But it does mean that you have to be on guard to prevent the misuse of scientific ideas to promote ideologies that are antisocial. One of the best sources for finding this demonization of Darwin's ideas of evolution by natural selection is in a recent movie a couple years ago, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, which starred the actor Ben Stein. Darwinian evolution is presented as a real bad guy here. The movie Expelled was produced with the encouragement and cooperation of the intelligent design promoting think tank, the Discovery Institute in Seattle. And the theme of the movie is that big science is persecuting intelligent design and its proponents because of the necessary link between evolution and atheism. The movie promotes the idea that Darwinian materialism, in other words, atheism, is a ponderous machine that is grinding down all the opposition. But the makers of Expelled are opposing this. They're saying, enough. The dark soul of Darwinian materialism. Go to their website, expelledthemovie.com. There's all kinds of this stuff here. This is a really good frame for trying to convince Americans of your point of view, because Americans love underdogs. So the idea of big science, the National Academy of Sciences. Would you really know the National Academy of Science if they walked down the main street? No, of course not. This is silly. Even sillier is the idea that the National Center for Science Education controls the National Academy of Sciences. This will come as a real surprise to Bruce Alberts and his colleagues. But anyway, this is a very dark and deep movie, but perhaps the most offensive, most of us scientists were pretty offended by this movie, particularly those of us who were in it who were lied to in terms of getting our participation, but that's another whole story. But perhaps the most offensive part is this linking of evolution with atheism, with Nazism, and the horrors of the Holocaust. And this page from the website, there's this little area here which I have blown up for you. Evolution leads to atheism, leads to eugenics, leads to Holocaust and Nazi Germany. This, by the way, is considered highly offensive by the Anti-Defamation League, which reacted very, very strongly that this was trivializing the Holocaust, and that obviously the relationship between Nazism, the Holocaust, and so forth, and evolution is complex and far, far more tenuous than what is described here. If you're curious about this movie, NCSC put up a website, expelledexposed.com. You can check it out, and there's a section here on the truth behind the fiction discussing this issue in more detail than I can do today. Similar views are held by a recent book by Benjamin Weicker called The Darwin Myth, and you got to watch the subtitle here. The subtitle is The Life and Lies of Charles Darwin. Many of us are more familiar with a similar book. Rita Skeeter's The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore. And quite honestly, The Life and Lies of Charles Darwin has similar accuracies. I will not take that. There will be a forthcoming review in the reports of NCSC. Now, there's also the demonization of Darwin the person, Darwin the individual, in addition to demonizing evolution and natural selection. Prominent in the demonization of Darwin himself is the idea that Darwin was a plagiarist. And of course, the most common claim is that Alfred Russel Wallace was ripped off, that Wallace sent his letter to Darwin in 1858, and Darwin cribbed it and wrote a natural selection and just basically stiffed poor Wallace, who ended up languishing away in poverty the rest of his life. Well, clearly, it's not quite the case. How many of you, did any of you see the NOVA program a couple weeks ago, Darwin's Darkest Hour? Oh, good. Some of the grown-ups. Well, the rest of you take a look at it, too. It's a 2-hour biography of Darwin, family life, and Darwin's Darkest Hour was receiving the letter from Wallace. He'd been working for 20 years, amassing all of this information on evolution by natural selection, and all of a sudden this guy says, hey, I was having this dream, and he kind of outlined all the basic ideas here. And so what do I do? And the major concern that Darwin had was, am I going to get scooped, and how can I be a gentleman about this? Because that was very important to Darwin. He was a gentleman, and he would have just crawled back to Down House and just continued watching worms if he thought that anybody would suspect him of behaving in an ungentlemanly fashion. And the compromise that was put together by his good friend Charles Lyell and his best friend, his truly, really soulmate, as it were, among his science friends, Joseph Hooker, was to have an abstract that Darwin had written decades before receiving Wallace's letter, and Wallace's letter read together at a meeting of the Linnaean Society, and then a joint article published by them. And when Wallace heard about this, because Wallace was stuck way the hell out in the Indies. He didn't know anything about this at all. It takes a long time for mail to get by ship back and forth. And, months later, Wallace got this letter saying, "Congratulations, you're an author. You have published a paper in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society of London." And Wallace wrote back he was over the moon. He was so happy that he had been included with the great Charles Darwin. All this stuff about how Darwin ripped off Wallace, Wallace certainly didn't think so. Wallace thought that Darwin had treated him extremely well and referred to evolution by natural selection as Darwinism. He didn't say Wallaceism. It was a very different situation. Edward Blythe is another one you find in the literature as a claimant to the idea that Darwin ripped him off, Darwin plagiarized from this guy. He was the curator of the Royal Asiatic Society of the Bengal Museum, so he was off in India. He was a naturalist, primarily an ornithologist, did a lot of very respected work, and he and Darwin corresponded quite a bit. Darwin respected him as a naturalist. In the 1830s, he wrote some articles on the effects of natural selection and suggested a natural process that was kind of parallel to natural selection that would produce variations in the wild, which is kind of the basic idea that Darwin used, of course. I mean, he also talked about artificial selection as a model for natural selection. But the outcomes of these two different views were very different. Darwin, of course, was arguing for transmutation, that you had adaptation and the idea of evolution. Blythe was really talking about returning to an archetype, so his idea was really quite different from that of Darwin's. It was really not a parallel idea. In 1959, the anthropologist and historian Lauren Isley claimed that Blythe's work had not only preceded Darwin, but that Darwin had cribbed the idea of natural selection from Blythe, and some examples even. Now, most scholars discount Isley's claims. You can read more about this. There are lots of resources on the web for this. The wonderful thing about Darwin is that he kept all his notebooks. He was an incredible pack rat. And he also had lots of correspondence with people, and they kept his letters. And so all of this, tremendous amounts of Darwin's writings and thoughts have been amassed generally at Cambridge, and much of this has been put online. So you can read it for yourself, which is even better. And the basic view of most of the Darwin scholars is that Darwin really had a very different idea of natural selection. He really did not encounter Blythe's ideas until after he had published on the origin of species. And Blythe never felt ripped off. I mean, Blythe himself certainly did not feel that Darwin had done him in. Patrick Matthew is another alleged victim of Darwin's plagiarism. He was a farmer and orchardist who wrote a book on forestry. He was very concerned about how the British Navy, which was, of course, the major engine of the empire, and of course they were all wooden ships, right? How can you produce the proper timber for those ships? So he wrote a book called Naval Timber, kind of a specialized tome, you can imagine. Probably read by a small group of very interested people, but not exactly a bestseller. He set out the basic idea of natural selection in 1831, which was decades before Darwin was to publish on the Origin of Species. And when Origin of Species came out in 1859, Matthew wrote an article to a magazine that was widely read, the Gardener's Chronicle, talking about, say, hey, I had these ideas first. And Darwin actually acknowledged that, yes, indeed, you have the basic ideas. This was a much more accurate paralleling, shall we say, of natural selection than the guy we just talked about, Blythe. This was much more along the lines of what Darwin was actually talking about. But again, this was a fairly obscure publication. Nobody really wrote it, and it's not really accurate to say that Darwin plagiarized, since Darwin certainly had his own sources for this. I think the historian Peter Bowler perhaps said it best, and I will quote him. He wrote, "Simple priority is not enough to earn a thinker a place in the history of science. One has to develop the idea and convince others of its value to make a real contribution. Darwin's notebooks confirm that he drew no inspiration from Matthew or any of the other alleged precursors." In the movie Expelled is another canard against Darwin, in which Darwin is presented as a racist. And he is often accused of being a racist or a sexist or some other practitioner of an ism. And this is a complicated subject. Was Darwin a racist? Well, Darwin was a person of his time. And it was a very common view among educated Victorians living in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century to believe that there was a hierarchy of races with, of course, white Europeans on top, and, of course, the English above the French. They were real sure about that. The French, of course, had the French above the English. So, we're not dealing with totally objective kinds of arguments here in the best of circumstances. And Darwin shared those general views, certainly. Does that make him a racist? Well, yeah, by modern standards, sure, but then so is everybody else. Interestingly enough, Darwin would be considered rather more enlightened for his time than many of his companions. He got in a big fight with Fitzroy when going around on the Beagle. They stopped in Brazil, and Darwin let fly his views on slavery, and Fitzroy thought slavery was perfectly fine because, of course, the Brazilian Indians and the Africans who were in Brazil as slaves were, of course, considered by them to be lower forms, and Darwin argued very strongly against enslavement. In fact, the family tradition was very strong, that very, very strong anti-slavery tradition. There's a new book by James Moore and Adrian Desmond called Darwin's Sacred Cause, in which the authors suggest that the anti-slavery attitudes of the Wedgwoods and the Darwin was a very strong motivation for Darwin to develop the idea of evolution by natural selection. The reviews are still out, but let me show you what Expelled says. Expelled writes, "With savages," this is quoting Darwin, "with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. We civilized man, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." That sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? Note about creationist quotations. Go to the original, because what you find is that they only quote each other, they never go back to the original sources, and the original source has a follow-up from Darwin which makes him sound not quite so awful. "The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of social instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy I'm having trouble reading. Nor could we check our sympathy, if so urged by hard reason, without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature." So he says, even if it would be better for these eugenic things, no way we could do this and still keep our humanity. This doesn't sound like a really mean guy. Very quickly, there's another kind of demonization going on regarding evolution. The Mysterious Origins of Man was a movie that came out promoting Hindu creationism, the Krishna creationists. It was based on a book, Forbidden Archaeology, which in this case is demonizing scientists more than anything else. It's demonizing the people who go out and study science as people who are not telling you the truth about all these old artifacts that go back millions and billions of years, showing that humans were all created at one time, but hundreds of millions of years ago. It was really quite terrible. We are running out of time. Let me just skip. On the other hand, there's always salvation at the end. And another myth that goes on about Darwin is that he recanted his evil evolution ideas on his deathbed. Didn't happen. Read Jim Moore's book, Darwin's Deathbed Confessions. It's a lot of fun. So here we are, and I will end with a little poem about Darwin. Not one that we would necessarily support, but he says, "There once was a preacher named Charlie D., whose degree was in Christianity, but he chose to take up botany, so he sailed aboard the HMS Beagle, that is. A fox of a man on a dog of a ship allowed his Christianity to slip and concocted a theory while at sea, destined to make monkeys of you and me." And he did. Now, don't anybody say that Eugenie Scott rapped at the Pepperdine meeting. That's not what I did. Anyway, more information. That's actually a talking blues, okay? An old folkie like me can do a talking blues. I don't do rap. If you go to ncsc.com, there's more information on this. If you go to this button, you can get on our weekly free electronic newsletter and find out what's going on. If you go to the news page here, you'll be taken to this page. You can sort for the state that you live in or the year, find out more information about what's going on in the creation and evolution controversy. You can also join. That would be a lovely thing. And I thank you once again for, and of course, like all good organizations, we are on Facebook. Thank you so much for inviting, the pearls were a good touch, don't you think? Thanks for inviting me for your program.
First of all, and I'm sorry that I appreciate Eugenie's presentation. I'm sorry she didn't have more time to talk about the so-called Lady Hope myth about Darwin's deathbed conversion. Because in fact, by comparison with the demonization of Darwin that we see in the contemporary era, the fact that evangelical Christians wanted to create a deathbed story, that Darwin had what was called in Victorian era a good death, suggests that they were concerned about Darwin in a way that wasn't so pejorative as the case is now. The title of this conference, of course, is Why Darwin Still Matters. Arguably, the talk of Eugenie's talk could be titled, Why is Darwin Still Demonized? It's an implicit question. Why Darwin? Why not other scientists? My fellow co-religionists have spent a good deal of time demonizing Darwin, who was, by all accounts, a remarkably decent human being. We seem to give a pass to somebody like Albert Einstein, who was, by all accounts, a remarkably not decent human being. It's always satisfying, I suppose, to make fun of what passes for science among creation science and intelligent design. But I wonder if the level of vitriol among anti-evolutionists suggests that something else is afoot. And it does seem to me that for persons of faith, there is something substantially more challenging with the theory of evolution than there is, say, in the theory of general relativity, atomic theory, or quantum theory. Now, maybe it's just because I don't understand those other theories as well as I understand evolution. I'm all for synthesizers like Ken Miller and Francis Collins and Eugenie herself, who look for ways to marry religion and science. But I think it's necessary to admit up front that, at least for religious believers, not for those of you who are not religious believers, evolution raises substantial and difficult questions about God's role in human history, what it means to be made in the image of God, what the purpose or telos of life is, and what it means to be a moral agent. I was struck in listening to Ed's presentation yesterday afternoon that these questions were raised almost immediately in response to Darwin, and that apparently they even arose among persons who were fully sympathetic with most parts of his theory of evolution. Ed convinced me that many of them were concerned about the implications of Darwinian evolution for core religious principles. Now, maybe David is right from this morning's presentation. If we give it enough time, those concerns will disappear, but I'm not entirely convinced. And in this regard, I'm going to turn the tables a little bit and focus some attention on scientists, because I think scientists often have been of very little help. For the better part of the past century, scientists have often presumed that with enough time and education, religious people will get with the proverbial program, abandon what they consider to be outmoded ideas, and enter the realm of scientific rationality. But a funny thing has happened on the way to this secular future. Religious people have rebelled. Scientists and others have been waiting now for some time for religion to disappear, and it has not. Far from it. By all accounts, religion has increased in recent decades as a social and political force. As if to further complicate the fact, there is a growing gulf between the religious views of scientists and the general public. According to a recent Pew survey, just over one-half of scientists, 51%, who are members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, say they believe in God or a higher power, and 41% say they do not believe in God. By contrast, 95% of Americans claim to believe in God or a higher power, and only 4% claim that they do not believe in God. Supporters of evolution have won every significant legal battle in the past 3 decades, rightly in my view, but they have not won the proverbial hearts and minds of the general public. And now I'm speaking as a political scientist, that can be a very dangerous position in which to be politically, where the legal status of the teaching of evolution is secured by the solons of the court rather than by the more popular branches of the government. Now, lest you conclude that this is another case of American exceptionalism, we learned yesterday that the anti-evolutionists are on the march around the world. Recent polling of worldwide opinion suggests that this is not simply crazy Americans who are having trouble reconciling their religious views with Darwinian evolution. Even in Darwin's native country, whose 10-pound note bears his image, just barely half of British respondents say that they believe in evolution, while nearly a quarter prefer theories of creationism or intelligent design to explain how the world came about. Now, given the fact that virtually no one in Britain actually goes to church, and that Britain is arguably the most secular country in the world, what does it suggest when Darwin has had a hard time getting majority support there? If Darwin can't easily win there, where can he win? To the extent that they care to convert more skeptics to a position congruent with evolution, I think scientists have 2 options. First, they can take the Dawkins-Dennett approach and pray for the day, rather ironic word, pray for the day, that religion recedes from the world and religious people come to their senses. I think there's probably something satisfying on both sides of the debate in bashing opponents for their narrow-mindedness, but this kind of hubris is both self-defeating and conducive to the kinds of counter-mobilization that Eugenie talked about this morning. Second, scientists could be more effective at demonstrating how there can be, in Darwin's words, a grandeur in the evolutionary view of life. Surely a part of that grandeur is the recognition that there are things that are beyond our knowing, that at the heart of the world lies mystery, and religion is and always has been exceptionally well-equipped in trading in mystery. It calls for a kind of humility and patience that is sadly lacking, I think, on both sides of the debate. And do I release them?
Is there a question? First of all, let's hear it for both of our speakers. Get at least one question in before we break. And again, I want to push, encourage as many of you as possible to, when we do the roundtable discussion at the end, please come, bring your questions. It's a time to have really have a dialogue with some of the leading thinkers on some of these issues. People spend a lot of time thinking about it, as have you. So before we break, I'd like at least one question. I believe there was one. I forgot where it went. Over there. Do you have a question? Yes.
It's not a question, it's just a comment.
Oh, sure, sure.
About is it Dr. Soper?
Yes.
Okay. As a scientist and as an evolutionary biologist, The goal of scientists is not to change people's opinion or views regarding any aspect of theology. So it's, an individual's desire to integrate any theological principles with any principles of science, that's up to you to make that decision. Science can't speak on it. The goal of science is strictly to provide avenues for understanding through particular processes of inquiry. But as a scientist, I cannot give you any critique because I have no tools to do it as to how to integrate theological principles with scientific principles.
I think that kind of humility is great. Not all of your colleagues share it.
Well, unfortunately, that's probably very true, but then I also make the claim that a lot of scientists don't understand the principles of how to do science either, which is one of the fundamental issues that we need to address within our educational system, both at a collegiate level as well as below that.
I think I'd like to follow up on that actually, because I was a little concerned when Dr. Soper was talking about scientist this, scientist that, because it sounded in the beginning of his talk as if he was equating scientists with atheists, scientists against religion. Of course, he did mention in the next paragraph, so to speak, if you can think in terms of paragraph of an oral presentation, but his next paragraph, he did talk about statistics showing that, in fact, not all scientists are atheists. About, that study was one study. There's another one talking about the religious views of science. There's starting to get more data on this. And 40% is a kind of a round, rough number that works with both of these studies. Not all scientists are atheists. Fewer scientists are theists than the general public, no question about that. But we have to be really careful when we're talking about science and religion that we don't equate science with atheism. I agree with you completely.
I'm not an atheist. I'm about as militant and agnostic as exists.
Scientists are across the board when it comes to their views. There are believers, there are non-believers, there are enthusiastic believers, there are enthusiastic non-believers, and people who just don't give a damn and wish this would just all go away and they could just get back to their lives. But the thing is, we all do science the same way, and science is about explaining the natural world. You can use science as a way to inform your religious or philosophical views. No question about that. Francis Collins uses evolution to inform his theistic philosophical views. I and Richard Dawkins use evolution to inform our non-theistic views. But neither of us can say legitimately that science compels either a theistic or a non-theistic view. And that, I think, is where we have to be really clear when we think about this and when we talk about this. Don't drag science into the culture wars. It's a really important way of knowing about the natural world. Let's not politicize it, okay? On the other hand, the discoveries of science as a powerful social institution, etc., are going to be used by ideologues. Religion is an ideology, a-religion is an ideology, and all the other ideologies I talked about. So it's okay to use science to support your point of view. Just don't be dogmatic about science compelling only one conclusion. Then I think we might be able to bring the heat down a little bit on this.
The real irony I see in this is that people on both sides make the same basic assumption. Philip Johnson and Dawkins both assume that if you accept evolution as a scientific theory, you therefore accept total materialism as your worldview. And as you just said, that's not true. But on both sides, they accept that basic assumption.
Yeah, but what side am I on that, gentleman? You say both sides as if there's only two. And of course, there's a continuum of views.
I'm talking about the two extremes. The two extremes.
As long as you express it as extremes, yeah.
Yes, that's what I mean.
There are middle views which are occupied by both theists and non-theists.
Right, absolutely.